He's the program manager for the Azure Blockchain Engineering Group. He's worked in the industry for over 20 years at Microsoft and IBM, and startups in wireless mobile, digital marketing, and e-commerce. He's an adjunct professor at NYU, and he's taught digital marketing, e-commerce, and entrepreneurship, and is currently developing a course on the user-centric economy called #OurNextEconomy. Welcome, Yorke Rhodes.
So I didn't know what to call this, so I called it Crossing the Chasm. I'm sort of going to take you on a little bit of a journey of where we are, what I'm seeing as signals that show me that we're crossing the chasm based on some other signals that we've experienced, depending on our age, in the industry before. So this is me. As Bill said, in 2015, I fell down the blockchain rabbit hole. And I had only returned to Microsoft 6 months before that, so I kind of had a decision to make. Am I going to stay at Microsoft, ensure that Microsoft doesn't miss the blockchain wave and that our CEO doesn't call blockchain a fad like Bill Gates called the internet a fad in 1993? And so I decided to stay and ensure that that didn't happen. Obviously, my other choice was leaving, but having just returned 6 months earlier, that didn't seem like the sensible thing to do. And having spent time actually teaching in entrepreneurship how to build startups inside of enterprises and done that once or twice before, I felt like this was a reasonable challenge for me to have over the next couple of years. So in that fall, I got together with a colleague of mine, Marley Gray. He actually spoke at DevCon 0, which is the Ethereum Developer Conference in London in 2015, and said, hey, we're going and we're doing this. At the time, the terminology blockchain as a service wasn't out yet, so basically that was sort of when it came into being as a terminology. Wind the clock forward 4 years later, and we actually, if you were watching the news in the last week, we shipped a ton of product to market. I mean, we've been shipping actually since early 2016, but this happened to be a pretty remarkable milestone on the journey, where we had actually the CTO of Azure on stage for quite a few hours looking at different products that we shipped this week, and also interviewing Vitalik Buterin, who was one of the founders and the intelligence behind the Ethereum chain. I sit on the blockchain engineering team, so it's an Azure blockchain engineering team. We actually have work spread across 3 regions of the world. What we just shipped this week was a whole bunch of developer tooling within our Visual Studio and Visual Code code base, as well as the tools that connect those developer tools into Azure so that you can very easily deploy workloads. And then we also shipped and announced a strategic announcement with JPMorgan Chase around the first ledger, which we have in a managed ledger offering called Azure Blockchain Service. And so JPMorgan actually is the founding body of Quorum, although it's an open source product, so we collaborate very closely with them anyway in the blockchain space. And then on the heels of that, we've also done an Azure strategic relationship with them, which should pull in a lot of work. So that's the end of the commercial. If you go search Microsoft blockchain, you can go find a ton of information about what we're doing in the space. Today, really, I'm going to talk about signals that I've been seeing that really sort of take us to where we are today and why I think we are at a particular point in history in our blockchain and crypto journey that's very similar in some ways to the internet. So, this is when people's eyes rolls and they say, oh my God, he's going to take me back to 1975. This is going to be like a 3-hour talk. I promise you it's not. So I'm going to quickly wind the clock forward to a actually seminal moment, which actually happens to be something that I was involved in and Microsoft was involved in 1995. And this moment was basically about shipping the Web 2 stack. Does anyone know what the Web 2 stack is? Just show of hands really quickly. Okay, so if you're on the internet, you're using the Web 2 stack, right? So basically, in 1995, Microsoft shipped Windows 95. It was the first operating system that shipped TCP/IP, which is the protocol of the internet, and a browser, right? So that is the Web 2 stack that we still use today, right? So many, many years later, we haven't actually done anything more than happened in 1995, right? If you think about that moment in time, this is before the dot-com boom and bust, right? There was really not much reason for people to be on the internet. But in 1995, Microsoft made this prescient decision to swap out, and if you look at the right-hand side there, you can see all the different protocol stacks that were in the Windows operating system at the time. The dominant one was Novell NetWare, for anyone who is older. That was the protocol stack that was in use in corporations all over the world. The only place that TCP/IP was in use was in New Jersey at AT&T Bell Labs. Right? And so for some reason, Microsoft said, hey, this is actually going to be a thing. We should make this the default protocol stack so that when you open up Windows 95, you can actually be on the internet. So consumers everywhere got very excited. Click. My clicky is not working. Clicker, stop working. There we go. Thank you. And they ran around with Windows 95 in their hands, and they basically celebrated being on Web 2 stack. Sure, that's exactly what they were doing. They had no idea that they were on Web 2 stack, nor did they really care, right? And that's kind of where we are today in terms of crypto and blockchain. Like, we're here preaching to the choir, right? You are an interested audience who decided that you want to be here because you want to hear about this new nascent technology and ecosystem and programmable money and whatever you want to call it, right? But that's not 95% of the world, right? And it wasn't then either, right? So that is one of the reasons why I think that we're sort of at a very similar moment. And let me just give you a couple of examples why I think actually 2019 feels very much like 1995. So the first thing is, what is Web 3 stack? Basically, Web 3 stack is capability that lets you be a blockchain first-class citizen through a browser or other mobile application experience in the operating system of your choice, whether it's on mobile or desktop or laptop, right? So a couple of things have happened recently this year that actually are hitting consumers whether they care or not, just like the people in 1995. One example is the Samsung S10 phone. Samsung has a huge market share. They're shipping an S10 phone that is a Web3 capable phone with a crypto wallet in it. Right? That means you can buy CryptoKitties and you can trade CryptoKitties and all the other great things that you want to do with a crypto wallet. Right? The other is relatively nascent market share in terms of a browser, but the Opera browser actually has a very nice implementation of a crypto wallet inside the browser that connects the mobile device to the desktop device so that you can actually keep control of stuff on your mobile from a wallet perspective. The onboarding experience into the Opera browser is actually the simplest onboarding that I've ever seen for a crypto wallet for a consumer. So those two things, now Opera is obviously a much smaller market share than Samsung, but Opera is based on Chromium. Chromium is basically the default stack essentially for browsers in the market. So it's a very interesting sort of vector that says, hey, browser vendors, you better wake up. Because this is coming. So those two things on the consumer side are actually quite interesting. And again, consumers generally don't care yet, right? But again, they didn't care in 1995. However, blockchain is entering the zeitgeist of consumers around the world. This happens to be actually in Rockefeller Center. I came up the subway one day recently, a couple weeks ago, and I was like, oh my God, there's an entire bookcase full of blockchain and next everything books, right? And so just the fact that it was in Rockefeller Center, like when you're going up the escalator, I was like, oh, that's a very odd place for this to be, but okay, there it is. At the Microsoft Build conference this week, we had a whole bookcase full of books that were on offer there as well, and Virgil Griffith, by the way, is in the Ethereum Foundation. He was there actually tweeting about this. And this is actually a very popular coffee brand on the right-hand side and a very popular software brand on the left-hand side. One of the announcements that we made this week was actually about bean-to-cup capabilities with Starbucks. And so I asked this question again, when can consumers celebrate being on Web3? And one of the answers you can actually give is basically when they can order a cup of coffee on Web3, right? And so the interesting announcement that we saw with Bakkt actually back in the fall was that someone at Starbucks was actually thinking about this actually very problem, right? So at Microsoft, and the way I look at sort of my role in the world is that it takes time to cross the chasm. So everything that we do is helping enterprises cross the chasm. So I gave you the Starbucks example. This is basically an end-to-end supply chain provenance visibility for bean-to-cup tracking, where consumers can know that their coffee actually came from a farmer in Guatemala or Ethiopia or what have you. And we've done some work with a bunch of different airline organizations, both on the cargo side as well as on the miles side with Singapore Airlines. I've been involved with a lot of social good projects in the blockchain space, both on the identity side of blockchain as well as on the pure blockchain side. And that's really to drive forward awareness in the NGOs that this is something that they need to paying attention to. And as I mentioned before, we just announced a strategic partnership with JP Morgan, and obviously they've been talking about their coin capabilities for a while. I get a lot of flack, or actually anybody who talks about enterprise blockchain gets a lot of flack on crypto Twitter, where a lot of people spend time trolling other people. And so, basically the response here to Starbucks was, hey, who gives a shit at Starbucks, and they have a vertical integrated supply chain, and, it's not really open, and it's not on the public internet. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because nobody was on the internet in 1995, right? Companies didn't go out and all of a sudden jump in 2 years into the internet, right, and say we can do e-commerce on the internet, right? It's the same problem, right? So we need to get companies comfortable with the technology so that then they can actually start to expose pieces of data and transactions that they're comfortable with into the public internet or public blockchain internets. This is an example of a project that I worked on last year. Our focus, my group's focus in the engineering team is actually specifically looking at advanced customer use cases where they're going to production with something that's interesting, and it's a real production application. So this is a World Bank Treasury last year actually launched a bond registered on blockchain, full bidding all the way through, and actually we're currently launching secondary trading so that the people who hold a position in the original bond can actually resell and trade that position, however they want in the secondary market. And so this is just an example of an organization. If you don't know what World Bank does, basically they do funding for development around the world. So a really critical part of everything that we think about when we're trying to do good in the world. World Bank is basically a flow of money that actually funds those different types of projects. So very interesting for signaling to the markets around the world, including central banks and international organizations and countries, that, hey, this is technology you really want to pay attention to. This was at the Build conference this week. The gentleman on the right you probably recognize, that's Vitalik Buterin. The gentleman on the left is the CTO of Azure, Mark Russinovich, and they were actually doing a discussion about the different types of technologies that Microsoft's been bringing to market around blockchain, and obviously specifically some around Ethereum as well. So in 2019, are we at this sort of tipping point? I think we are actually, based on some of the things that I've told you so far. We obviously have some hurdles we have to overcome, one of which is who wants to walk around being their own bank, and how do we fix that problem? And how do we actually, treat keys in a way that's sensible for consumers that don't really know what they're doing with passwords today? So this is an area I think needs to be a certain amount of investment in, both in the consumer side as well as in the institutional side. So with that, in summary, I think we're there. Feels to me like we're there. Feels very much like what no one really sort of recognized in 1995 was happening. But the technical evolution of this journey that I've been on only since 2015 really feels like it's getting to the tipping point with a lot of the different things that are going on. So I'm going to leave you all with one question, which is, this is a picture I took in London, by the way, recently. When you look back in 2 years, and this is something I always ask people because it's a really interesting way to think about what you're going to do for the next 2 years. But when you look back in 2 years, so that's 2021, what will you be able to say you've accomplished? So think about that. In 2 years, what are you going to go out and do? Thank you.